Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping into 1963, a year of bright hope and sudden darkness. A year when dreams marched on Washington, voices reached for the moon, and a single afternoon in Dallas left the country forever changed. It was a year that began with optimism. America was young, confident, and moving fast in technology, in culture, and in its vision for the future. But it would end with a hush, a quiet in the streets, and an ache that would linger for generations. Tonight, we'll walk through it slowly, feeling the rhythm of everyday life, the big moments that lifted hearts, and the one that broke them. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. Step into January of 1963. The air is cool and clean. Shop windows gleam with sleeveless dresses in bright citrus shades, and the faint aroma of coffee escapes from diners where little brass bells announce each customer. The hum of daily life feels steady, like the slow click of a television dial in a living room with floral wallpaper, or the sound of a gas pump filling a tank when fuel was still cheap enough to feel like an afterthought. In the White House, a young president addresses the nation with calm confidence, his voice carrying the kind of optimism people lean toward. For most Americans, the year began with the sense that they knew the pattern of their days. Prices and possessions spoke to a different rhythm than ours. Everyday items felt affordable, their numbers small enough to tuck into memory without worry. Bread, milk, postage, costs most could cover with coins from the change dish. In the growing suburbs, new ranch-style houses sat framed by tidy lawns. Inside, soft pastel furniture filled the rooms. Mint green chairs, peach-colored cabinets, cushions patterned with the geometric shapes of post-war design. These were homes meant to look fresh and modern, even if the routines inside them stayed much the same. On television, familiar company filled the evenings. Families laughed with The Andy Griffith Show, rode along with Bonanza, and marveled at the antics of the Beverly Hillbillies. With fewer channels, there was little debate over what to watch. Music flowed from radios, folk ballads alongside the first beats of a sound that would soon be known to every household, Motown. At the movies, sweeping dramas shared space with light musicals, promising escapes into worlds just a little more polished than real life. Beneath it all ran a current of reassurance, a country feeling at ease in its habits, even as quiet changes gathered on the horizon. In the White House, Jacqueline Kennedy's presence brought something more than politics into the public eye. She was a symbol of style. From her pillbox hats and sleeveless A-line dresses to the simple pearl strands at her collarbone, women across the country imitated her look, sometimes with small homemade touches, sometimes with store-bought versions of her outfits. Magazines lingered on her fashion and her poise, presenting her as the modern image of American grace. And there was one particular suit, a bright pink ensemble with a navy blue collar, that, in time, would become an image history could not forget. Yet even amid that polished surface, the year's beginning carried its quiet background notes. In many towns, plans for civil rights marches were whispered over coffee or organized in church basements, while arrests and legal battles marked growing tensions. Far away, The Cold War pressed on, its presence felt in brief headlines, nuclear drills at schools, and the cautious language of diplomatic meetings. Most households didn't dwell on it. Conversations more often turned to weekend plans or ball games. Life for many stayed focused on that comfortable middle distance, aware of the larger world, but not yet unsettled by it. The Kennedy administration's early 1963 schedule seemed smooth and predictable. State visits, speeches, and policy discussions announced well in advance. This regularity was part of what reassured people. Even at home, lives followed their patterns. Work in the morning, dinner at the table, children doing homework, church on Sundays. The sense of order felt structural, something baked into the days themselves. The mood of the era showed up in what people wore, drove, and lived alongside. Men's suits were slim and neat, ties narrowing again, while women's hair was swept high in bouffants or shaped into careful flips. Cars gleamed in two-tone paint, with chrome bright in driveways where children rode bikes in looping circles. Inside, hints of the space age were everywhere. Starburst clocks, low coffee tables with curves like satellites, lamps angled as if ready to illuminate the future. Entertainment reinforced this balance between tradition and gentle progress. Pop singers performed songs easy to hum. Variety shows offered warm humor, music, and polite chatter. Neighbors could trade lines from last night's program, knowing most had seen the same thing. Grocery store shelves held familiar products, the labels changing little from year to year. The pace of life and the pace of change matched, both moving slowly enough for comfort. But between these familiar scenes, forces were gathering. Civil rights leaders assembled plans for a year of visible action. Across the ocean, talks and tension shaped policies behind closed doors. Scientists prepared space missions to push human travel further. By May, Gordon Cooper would orbit Earth in the final flight of NASA's Mercury program, a milestone that captured the country's forward-looking side. Technology was stirring, ready to reshape communication and life in ways few could picture. Most people brushed past such developments, glancing at the headlines before turning the page. To those living through it, stability seemed secure. Filling the car with gas was ordinary, not worth remembering. Coins for groceries were just part of the week. Children practiced neat cursive while teachers covered chalkboards in even rows of letters. The mail was delivered with dependable rhythm. Bills, letters, catalogs for the latest appliances. The mechanics of daily life spun without interruption. This was how the year began. Not with constant drama, but with an unbroken hum. Looking back, the optimism of January rested on ground already shifting. Yet that wasn't how it felt inside the moment. Most stepped into these first months with no reason to imagine they were on the cusp of upheaval. The Kennedy family's public image, young and disciplined, seemed to reflect the same control people felt in their own schedules. Surfaces can hide fault lines. Behind pastel kitchens and polished lawns, there was the first tremor of changes ahead. Decisions made in offices and in living rooms during those early weeks would ripple outward, meeting events no one foresaw. It was a moment when comfort and complacency shared the same space, and when the signs of progress were already glinting, ready to catch the national eye. If you picture a gas station attendant leaning on the pump, or families stepping into church, or teachers handing out another list of spelling words, you can catch that early 1963 glow. It was a glow built as much on habit as it was on hope. That period held, for just a while, a feeling that tomorrow would be much like today. But the seasons don't stay still. Soon, the air of spring would bring with it more than blossoms or the sound of lawn mowers. It would carry voices, footsteps, and songs that would press the country toward a different kind of year. By spring, the mood of the year was changing. Across certain cities, the air carried chants, songs, and the deliberate rhythm of marching feet. These were not parades. They were demands, visible, unignorable, moving block by block, insisting that the nation live up to its own promises. In Birmingham that May, it was young people who stepped into the front lines. Boys in pressed shirts and girls in Sunday dresses left schoolrooms and church basements knowing they would face arrests, fire hoses, and police dogs. The Children's Crusade, as it came to be called, unfolded under skies that alternated between warm sunlight and the heavy spray of water knocking people from their feet. A photographer's split-second capture might show a teenager's face uplifted mid-song, while on the other side of the frame stood officers holding straining leashes. Those images traveled quickly. The country saw them in newspapers and, more powerfully, on nightly television news. In living rooms far from Alabama, the scene stirred strong reactions. Sympathy and resolve in some, defensiveness and anger in others. How could a nation sing Motown on its radios even as fire hoses soaked children in Alabama? In Washington, the Kennedy administration watched events escalate. By June, the president chose to speak plainly, addressing civil rights as a moral issue that cut to the heart of American identity. His words inspired many and signaled that the federal government might take a more active role. For others, it was an unwelcome message that local customs could no longer remain untouched. The summer's momentum carried into late August. On August 28th, hundreds of thousands stood together on the National Mall, filling the green expanse from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. In the glare of the sun, they listened to voices calling for jobs and freedom, for fairness written into law, as well as lived in practice. The March on Washington ended with a speech that would echo far beyond that day. Its phrases memorized, its images embedded in collective memory. For some in the crowd, the future seemed briefly within reach. But around that great gathering stood invisible barriers, complicated legislation in Congress, entrenched prejudice in local communities, and the weary knowledge that change, even when inevitable, resists the timetable of hope. Through all of this, the soundtrack of daily life refused to stand still. On radios and kitchens and cars, Motown singles climbed the charts, polished harmonies shaped in Detroit, where bass lines and tambourines met the universal themes of love and longing. These songs crossed social lines, resonating with listeners who might not agree on which marches to support, but could hum the same melody. And from across the Atlantic, the first ripples of the British invasion would soon touch American shores, hinting at a cultural order ready for revision in its own way. While voices for justice pressed forward on the ground, eyes occasionally turned upward. In May, Mercury Atlas 9, NASA's final Mercury mission, carried astronaut Gordon Cooper on a record-setting flight, circling Earth more times than any American had before. The achievement showed that precision, skill, and discipline could push the limits of the known world. Back on the surface, progress came in smaller, quieter forms. On July 1st, the Postal Service introduced zip codes nationwide, 5 simple digits, promising swifter mail delivery across a country that was growing busier by the day. Soon after, in a few cities, rotary phones began to give way to touch-tone dialing, the short beeps foreshadowing a faster pace of communication. Beyond America's borders, the year brought one example of cooperation in a world tilted toward confrontation. In August, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, agreeing to end nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. It did not halt the arms race, but it slowed one of its most dangerous aspects. For citizens at home, the treaty was another sign. Like space flights, like new technology, that change was possible through deliberate human effort, if not always at the speed or in the direction everyone wanted. The strands of 1963 wove together unevenly. Civil rights workers risked their safety in the streets. Musicians bridged divides with 3-minute songs. Scientists and engineers reached beyond Earth's horizon. Diplomats in far-off rooms tried to keep the world from the brink. Depending on where you stood, it could look like the country was racing forward or jerking unevenly between breakthroughs and setbacks. In some towns, marches passed without confrontation. In others, they ended in violence and jail cells. That contradiction, progress shadowed by resistance, was the year's defining tension. For many Americans, there was pride in living through a moment that felt historic. Children memorized their new zip codes for the start of the school year. Families watched rocket launches on black and white televisions. Neighborhood block meetings shared updates about court rulings and civil rights bills. And yet, over coffee or at the dinner table, conversations sometimes drifted into uneasy pauses. Moving forward brought the promise of change and the uncertainty of what change would require. As autumn arrived, schools filled again, fields yielded their crops, and familiar holidays approached. Newspapers carried reports of new laws debated, treaties signed, and technologies unveiled. In that moment, it seemed the calm of the year's beginning and the urgency of its middle months might settle into a kind of balance. But time carried its own quiet current, moving steadily in a direction few could clearly see. By late November, events far from Washington, Birmingham, and Cape Canaveral would draw the country's full attention. Morning light would fall clean across a Texas city, and for a brief stretch, its streets would hum with nothing more extraordinary than expectation. Before the day's course shifted, Dallas opened its morning under a sky as pale and even as fresh paper, the kind that sharpens shadows and edges. The air carried a light chill that filled the shade, but when the sun found open ground, it was warm enough to touch faces through coats and jackets. Along the route chosen for the presidential motorcade, people claimed spots early, resting elbows on railings or balancing on low brick walls. It was the kind of quiet, watchful anticipation you see before a festival or a visiting parade. Children held their parents' hands and rocked forward on polished shoes. Small American flags, pinned to thin wooden sticks, snapped faintly whenever a breeze threaded down the avenue. November in Dallas didn't bring bare sidewalks or icy wind. Here, the season was crisp sky and the faint scent of dry leaves curling in gutters. You could read the mood in the shine of people's shoes. the neatness of haircuts, and the Sunday best clothes that appeared midweek. Women in gloves and hats, men in pressed shirts and ties, jackets shrugged on and off as the sun shifted. Office workers slipped away from desks. Teachers gathered their classes along the curbs. Taken together, it looked like neighbors coming out to see guests whose importance they'd been told about, and whose presence seemed worth stepping away from ordinary duties. There had been caution in the background. Newspapers mentioned security concerns, and in recent memory, Adlai Stevenson had been jostled and spat on during a visit here the month before. The White House had taken note. But along this stretch of road, those warnings felt like they belonged elsewhere. The low, idle rumble of police motorcycles waiting at side streets rose above faint murmurs of any unease. At the center of it all, the plan for the day seemed intact. A slow, public drive through downtown streets to show the President and First Lady to those who wanted to see them. When the black 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible came into sight, with its clear plastic bubble top left off now that the earlier rain had passed, the pace of the crowd's conversation shifted. Jacqueline Kennedy sat beside the president, her pink suit and navy-collared jacket distinct against the dark gleam of the car's body, the matching pillbox hat tilted neatly over her hair. The color drew every camera, its brightness fixed exactly for the sun. In front of them sat Texas Governor John Connally in a dark suit and his wife Nellie in a coordinating skirt and jacket. 4 uniformed Dallas police officers rode motorcycles in a diamond formation around the limousine, their chrome catching flashes of light as they moved. The president returned the crowd's attention with an easy wave, a motion that carried evenly across each side of the street. Storefronts mirrored the procession, throwing quick images of the open car and its passengers back toward those lining the curbs. Banners slung from lampposts shifted in the breeze above the crowd. Every window that could be opened or leaned out of had a cluster of faces watching from above. The pace wasn't hurried, just slow enough for an extended glance, a nod, a wave. The low hum of the Lincoln's engine was layered with bursts of applause and the thin whip of paper flags. Between those bursts, there was the softer sound of people talking in small knots, calling to friends across the street, adjusting children on their shoulders for a better view. The motorcycles flanked and punctuated the scene, keeping their steady arc as the motorcade moved forward. From above, the procession followed the city grid like a line of deliberate handwriting: presidential car, support vehicles, security, and others carrying staff and reporters. Some in the crowd waved toward the press cars briefly, but attention stayed on the Kennedy car. Now and then, someone called out, "Welcome to Texas," or "Hello, Jackie." Their voices lifted into bright patches before folding back into the hum. The November sun caught faces in a stronger light here than it would farther north this time of year. Heat built gently on dark polished leather, on the tidy pleats of skirts and trousers. Now and then, a camera caught the glare and left a pale burst in the corner of a frame. A few men loosened ties. Women removed gloves to wave more easily. Up near the front of the route, before the turn toward Dealey Plaza, the energy in the crowd rose and released in predictable cycles. Anticipation swelling as the motorcade neared, then cheers, laughter, and flag waving as it passed. The Kennedys and Connollys responded with small waves and smiles. turning their heads to catch both sides of the street. To a person watching from the curb, the drive looked both open and ordered, a public appearance carried out just as it had been planned in earlier city meetings. Police posted at corners watched steadily, but without visible strain, chatting briefly when approached by someone in the crowd. The sounds around them repeated in a pattern: engine, cheer, flag snap, engine, allowing time to notice storefront signs or the way sunlight angled in between taller buildings. The turn into Dealey Plaza came like any other in the route, with the buildings ahead seeming a little taller, their shadows longer across the street. The warm air brought the dry smell of fallen leaves underfoot and more distinct exhaust drifting from the moving vehicles. American flags fixed high on poles cracked crisply overhead, each snap in the same register as the handheld flags along the curb. In the Lincoln, Governor Connolly shifted in his front seat to turn toward the crowd, while the president looked left, Mrs. Kennedy's gaze moving in the opposite direction. The two Secret Service agents on the running board scanned the edges of the route, the forward car carrying more agents in alert postures. Around 12:30 p.m., those watching from offices and sidewalks saw the motorcade steady itself for the gradual curve down Elm Street. Some checked wristwatches. Others leaned a touch farther out into the street for a last glimpse before the cars would pass entirely. The corner was bright and calm, flags moving lightly, children still lifted high on shoulders. Few in that moment had reason to think the rhythm would change. The air still carried the sounds of cheer and machinery in familiar balance. The procession held its line through the plaza's opening stretch, approaching the low white colonnade and the green slope beyond. From where we stand in this recollection, the sweep of the limousine down Elm is the next turn in a carefully mapped route. The air is warm, the street lined, the timing exact. The crowd leans forward together, eyes fixed on a small open space ahead. What came next happened in less time than it takes to breathe 3 times. As the limousine rolled further down Elm Street, the air split with a sound that didn't belong there. Most witnesses later recalled hearing 3 shots, each spaced only heartbeats apart. At first, some thought it might be firecrackers from a hidden celebration, or the backfire of a truck somewhere out of sight. Heads turned in uneven waves, some startled, some still smiling, unsure if they had truly heard what they thought they had. The cheerful motion of flags slowed. Voices cut off mid-cheer. The car's steady glide faltered. Elm Street narrowed here, with brick and concrete walls that caught sound and threw it back in strange echoes. Above, the November sky stayed a seamless blue, but that calm was gone at street level. After the first report, bodies shifted. After the second, eyes began searching. By the third, some understood, without words, that the day had shifted, and they broke into sudden runs. Some toward shelter, some into the open, each movement sharp and unplanned. Close to the president's car, the neat symmetry of the escort dissolved. Motorcycle officers accelerated hard, the rattle of engines climbing high. Secret Service agents moved fast toward the open convertible, their earlier stillness replaced by precise, urgent strides. The air seemed to sharpen, flag fabric snapping louder, footsteps quick against pavement. Those nearest the limousine stared at the figures inside, trying to read meaning in the lean and reach of bodies. each gesture carrying an unspoken signal that something was terribly wrong. Dealey Plaza, only a moment earlier shaded and scattered with small knots of people, was now a funnel of noise. Some stood rooted, cameras raised without pressing the shutter. Others shouted upward toward distant windows. The black Lincoln surged forward, the driver accelerating hard out of the plaza. For those watching, it was suddenly gone, vanishing past the curve toward the Stemmons Freeway, trailed by the bark of sirens. On that last piece of the route, motion blurred, motorcycles flanking tight, agents leaning in, the presidential party now screened by bodies in steel. Where minutes before the crowd's noise had been laughter and welcome calls, now it was a low churn of speculation. People turned to strangers beside them, looking for a face that might confirm what they themselves had heard. Some pressed into shop doorways. Others hurried away toward radios, telephones, or any place they could get news. Within the motorcade, the schedule disintegrated. Forget the Trade Mart luncheon. The only destination was now Parkland Memorial Hospital. Speed swallowed distance. At the front, sirens merged into one long, insistent note. Red lights were ignored, traffic shoved aside by the push of engines and escort. Through stretches of concrete and open sky, every second carried the weight of urgency. At approximately 12:38 p.m., the lead car reached Parkland's emergency entrance. Doctors and nurses were already in motion before the Lincoln braked under the covered drive. The scene snapped into the rhythms of trained response. Hands reaching, voices calling instructions, gurneys wheeled forward. Inside, fluorescent-lit corridors replaced sunlight, the air dense with orders and the metallic rattle of equipment. Back across Dallas, news was only beginning to ripple. In nearby offices, people leaned out of windows. The first fragments passed in hurried phrases. Radios shifted tone. Announcers careful with words they could not yet confirm. In living rooms across the country, music or soap operas were abruptly interrupted by voices reading the first bulletins. Some stations switched to a plain text slide, the location, the broad facts still unsteady. The nation's understanding formed in uneven patches. In Trauma Room 1, the medical team worked with practiced urgency. At exactly 1 p.m., Central Standard Time, President John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. There were no speeches, only the formal statement, recorded and witnessed. Outside the small room, aides and officials stood motionless. A call was placed to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been riding farther back in the motorcade, to tell him the news. Even amid shock, the transfer of authority moved forward. Johnson, now president by law, was urged to leave under escort. The motorcade reassembled and drove to Love Field. Air Force One waited, gleaming under the same blue Dallas sky. Inside its cabin, small and crowded, an oath of office was prepared. At 2:38 p.m., with a federal judge presiding and a Bible held at his side, Johnson took the oath as the 36th President of the United States. Jacqueline Kennedy stood nearby, still in the pink suit she had worn that morning. The photograph taken in that narrow aisle would become one of the most recognized images of the century. Back at Parkland, the entrances slowly cleared. Some in the crowd lingered, unwilling to leave without more to hold on to. Reporters gathered, waiting for a statement. Photographers stayed close, cameras ready but idle for now. Across Dallas, traffic began to move again, slowly, as radios carried updates into every car. Flags above downtown still stirred in the breeze, looking no different than they had hours earlier. Though to those who had heard the news, everything had changed beneath them. Beyond Texas, the same fragmented reports were stitching toward a single account. By mid-afternoon, television anchors across the networks repeated the key points. The motorcade entered Dealey Plaza around 12:30 p.m. Shots were fired as it continued down Elm Street. Most witnesses recalled 3 reports. The president was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath aboard Air Force One at 2:38 p.m. In the hours that followed, more details were added, including that police had arrested a suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee at the Texas School Book Depository, from where the shots were believed to have come. Later that same afternoon, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot and killed in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. And before evening, Oswald was taken into custody inside the Texas Theater. That night, he was formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy. These facts settled into the day's record, but for most Americans, they lived first as scenes and sounds. A glimpse of the open car turning the corner, the sudden crack carried on the air, the rush of motorcycles out of the plaza, a voice on the radio, quieter than usual, the name of the hospital, the time. It was a sequence that didn't need embellishment. The sharp interruption in Dallas unfolded into a national moment exactly as people had experienced it. Shot through with confusion, hushed by confirmation, bound together by a chain of events that changed the country before the day's light was gone. And as those first hours closed, the shock had only just begun to settle. What followed would not be measured in minutes or siren blasts, but in the stillness that took hold everywhere. A stillness unlike anything the nation had known in peacetime. For much of the next 4 days, the country moved at half its usual pace. Offices told workers to go home. Schools closed, their lessons left mid-sentence on chalkboards, windows left dark. Storefronts that had glittered a week before now stood unlit, some covered in paper, others simply dim. It was not an absence of people, but a deliberate slowing, a choice by millions to step back from their routines and stand together in one long, unspoken moment. Television carried that moment into nearly every home. Continuous coverage ran without entertainment or advertisements. The same flickering images connecting millions in real time. Streets in many towns were so quiet you could hear the wind between buildings, while behind drawn shades, sets cast a pale glow across rooms where families sat for hours. In some, 3 generations shared the couch in stillness. In others, neighbors pulled chairs close to the screen just to be with someone else as they watched. Outside, the stillness drifted into public space. People gathered on porches and stoops, saying little, content simply to share the quiet. Cars passed slowly, drivers lifting a hand in silent acknowledgement. Even in cities that lived on a constant hum, footsteps on sidewalks seemed softer, more deliberate. The rituals that formed gave people shape to their days when there was nothing practical to be done. The president's body arrived in Washington and lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda beneath a precisely folded flag. Around 250,000 mourners filed past in lines that crept forward for hours under the November sky. Many carried nothing, no flowers, no signs, just the decision to be there, to take a few slow steps in that high, round room, and to leave in the same silence they'd entered. President Johnson had declared November 25th a national day of mourning, and its approach was felt in that steady march of ordinary citizens through the heart of government. Television covered it all without break. Cameras followed the black-draped caisson as it moved through the streets, the riderless horse behind it swaying to the pace of the marchers. Viewers saw the reversed boots in the stirrups, an emptiness that seemed to explain itself. And in one brief frame, a small boy stepped forward from the crowd, John Jr., and raised his hand in salute as the casket passed. It was a child's quick gesture, but in living rooms across the country, it landed with the weight of the moment, closing the distance between national grief and personal loss. Homes took on the soundscape of those days, the quiet murmur of reporters' voices, the slow cadence of drums, chairs shifting as people leaned closer to the screen. In hotel lobbies, diners, and store window displays where televisions had been set up, strangers stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking, leaving only when the coverage moved on to the next scene. In smaller towns, the absence of everyday noise was sharper still. Church bells rang at fixed hours, and flags hung at half-staff, barely stirring in the cool air. After dark, light spilled into the streets from curtained windows, part television, part lamps kept on later than usual, as if people were reluctant to let the day end. There was action beneath the stillness. Letters of condolence went into envelopes bound for the First Lady. Children's drawings were taped to classroom walls. Families set photographs of the president beside flowers on mantels. Yet the predominant movement was slow, deliberate, leaving space for both public ceremonies and private recollections. Watching the funeral procession or the rotunda broadcast, mind and heart drifted to personal markers. Where you were when you heard, who first told you, the phone call you made next. Those fragments began to attach themselves to the larger story, so that one could not be recalled without the other. By the fourth day, the ceremonies had become fixed points in memory. The flag on the casket, the long queues in the cold, the sound of muffled drums, the child's salute. It was mourning for a man and an office, but also for the moment itself, when the line between the world before and the world after was sharp enough to feel. Late that Monday, after the services ended, news outlets began to loosen their hold. Stations returned to regular programming. Radios brought music back into their schedules. People switched off their televisions, stood in the quiet, and then turned to whatever small tasks waited. The streets were still calm, but cars began to pass more frequently. Stores opened their doors. School bells marked a schedule again. The long pause dissolved, leaving behind the knowledge of what it had felt like when nearly everyone moved at the same slowed pace. Those days would live on, not just in archives, but in the minds of those who walked through them. One slow step, one long hour at a time. Life would resume, but it would do so with the shadow of that stillness still touching the edge of each new day. And in the weeks that followed, as routines returned and the season shifted, the memory of those quiet hours remained close, even as the world began, cautiously, to move forward again. By early December, the signs of regular life were edging back into view. Radios, quiet for days except for news, began carrying music again, their playlists now touched by sharper rhythms from across the Atlantic. In December, the Beatles' first U.S. singles arrived, songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, their bright harmonies and insistent beats sounding unlike the crooners and folk voices that had filled most of the year. The shift was subtle, but it announced itself with energy that hinted at a larger wave just offshore. Alongside the music, familiar changes from earlier in the year continued to take root. ZIP codes, introduced in July, now stamped in neat rows after city and state, slowly becoming habit in letters and holiday cards. In some kitchens and offices, the rotary phone's steady spin was giving way to the clean, quick tones of new push-button sets. These were modest things, easily folded into the day's errands or seasonal chores, yet each carried the quiet sense of moving forward. Motown still threaded through the airwaves, sharing space now with this new British sound, while at home, small tasks resembled those of any late-year calendar. Children cutting stars and bells from colored paper for school hallways. Postal workers sorting winter mail by their updated codes. Storekeepers noting stock for the holiday rush. Here and there, someone might pause in the middle of a task without realizing why. The memory of November touching the edges of their thoughts before they set their hands moving again. The return to ordinary tradition seemed deliberate that winter. Church basements smelled of pine and candle wax during pageants. Choirs rehearsed carols in town halls. Tree lightings gathered neighbors in small, bright clusters around brass bands, playing familiar arrangements. In homes, ornament boxes emerged from attics. Tissue paper crinkled as it was unwrapped. Old glass bulbs and homemade shapes placed with the same care as years before. Some families quietly wove the loss into these rituals, placing a framed photograph on the mantel beside evergreen branches, lighting an extra candle at the table. Simple gestures that kept the memory near without speaking it aloud. In school auditoriums, folding chairs filled for holiday plays. Parents and grandparents clapped for shepherds in bathrobes and reindeer with hand-painted antlers, the glow from stage lights catching glitter on cardboard crowns. The whispered instructions backstage, wait for your cue, speak up, smile toward the front, were the same as they had been for decades. For adults, watching these small, rehearsed performances offered something steady, a moment with a beginning and end entirely under control. Shops and department stores returned to their long hours, their windows set with winter mannequins under artificial snow. Transactions at the register sounded almost like they had before. Coins ringing against wood, paper bags rustling. Though for some, each purchase carried a different kind of weight. A careful return to spending, or a conscious choice to give gifts as reminders that the season's meaning could be kept intact. Decorations glowed in the same streets, but now they shared space with newspaper stands where headlines had only recently carried the weight of history. There were practical changes, ones that reached into the daily workings of government. In the weeks after the assassination, the Secret Service reassessed how presidents moved through the world. Open limousines disappeared from motorcades. Security staffing increased, and routes were more tightly controlled. These shifts began quietly, in revised protocols and altered schedules, but over time, they became part of public awareness. The closeness between president and citizen now passed through a layer of protection that would not be set aside. On November 29th, President Johnson created the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination, framing an official record that would be studied, debated, and preserved. For others, the deeper change was in perception, the loss of a certain innocence about the office and the nation itself. The Cold War had already tested assumptions about safety and leadership, but Dallas brought the threat into open daylight, in front of witnesses and cameras, without the filter of distance. It became harder to see the country as apart from such violence. The understanding that history can turn in an instant lodged itself into the national memory. Yet 1963's meaning isn't held only in its tragedy. Space flights earlier that year, including Gordon Cooper's record-setting mission, pointed toward heights that would soon be reached in full. New connections formed in the everyday. Postal zip codes standardizing addresses, telephones beginning their shift to push-button ease. On televisions, Motown harmonies shared airtime with the first thrilling notes of a British sound that would soon arrive in force. And in November, those same televisions had shown the nation its own capacity to pause, to share loss in real time. Placed across the timeline of the decade, the year is an inflection point. Before it, much of the early 60s still carried the organized optimism of the years just after the war. After it, the country entered a stretch defined by open conflict on streets and campuses, cultural experimentation in music, art, and dress, and deep generational debates about the meaning of patriotism, equality, and progress. The hinge analogy works because what followed was an opening into a future difficult to picture from the other side. Even the smallest images carry its weight. Look at a photograph from spring. Crowds leaning eagerly toward a passing motorcade, faces open, postures easy. Compare it to one from December. Coats held closer, expressions drawn, eyes sharpened by something now known. Side by side, the contrast speaks without needing words. For many people, 1963 settled into memory as a measure of impermanence, that even the most solid-seeming moments could be altered without warning. For others, it became a model for shared experience in both celebration and grief. The quiet processions, the flags at half-staff, the unbroken lines of mourners through the Capitol Rotunda showed how people could gather without any agenda but to mark a passing together. In later years, in different circumstances, that capacity would resurface. Look back, and the textures of the year are all there. A January morning with store windows bright in pale sun. An August afternoon on the mall, with voices carrying over the reflecting pool. A November sky above still Texas air. Television glow on drawn curtains. Fresh postmarks with their new 5-digit codes. A record player's needle lifting from a Motown single. Each could stand alone, but together they form this particular year's shape, weighted not by only what ended or began, but by how close those two things came to each other. This is why 1963 is remembered less as a sequence of separate episodes and more as a whole. One that wove personal lives with public events without ever fully untangling them. Gas stations, school hallways, shop counters, front porches, all were places the year passed through, leaving marks sometimes small, sometimes lasting. Its meaning rests as much in the touch points of daily life as in its recorded history. And yet, as it returns to its place in the long line of years, its details remain within reach. The polished ease of Camelot, the determined steps of marchers on sunlit avenues, the slow beat of a funeral drum beside a riderless horse, the steady flame of a candle placed in a window against the dark. These are scenes that ask no explanation, only recognition. They hold the shape of a year that carried both promise and loss, both beginnings and endings. Somewhere in those images is the connection between private reflection and the broader story a nation tells itself. It is a quiet link, one that waits still in the memory of streets and rooms where the year passed, ready to be called up again when the light falls just so, or when the air settles into the same late season calm. Picture a quiet street settling into evening. A light rain has been falling for hours, soft enough to hear, but steady enough to leave the pavement shining under the lamps. Droplets tick against the windows of houses set back from the road. Pooling water trembles in the glow of each streetlight, and every so often, a slow-moving car passes, its tires making a brief, gentle hiss before fading into the distance. In one front window, a single candle burns. The flame isn't large, but it's the brightest thing in that pane of glass, the only clear point in the dim interior. From the sidewalk, you can see it shift slightly when the rain taps harder on one side of the frame, its light steadying again between each movement. Against the softer shadows behind it, the candle's glow is both simple and deliberate, easy to read without any need for words. Inside, the rest of the room stays in low light, a single lamp turned down so it doesn't wash out the flame. There's a faint scent of rain in the air, mixed with the familiar warmth of books and paper resting in place for years. A radio plays quietly. This time, not the tense cadence of news broadcasts, but a low thread of music. Someone sits nearby, close enough to watch the street, through both the flame and their own faint reflection. This isn't a candle to guide someone home or signal an arrival. It's lit for something less tangible, a thought that belongs partly to history and partly to the person who struck the match. From outside, you wouldn't know which houses hold someone in the same frame of mind. Some glow bright in every room, hums of television spilling into the rain. Others are as dim as this one, their quiet marked only by the sound of water filling the gutters. But the candle pulls the eye because it offers a single, unblinking point in all that stillness. It asks a passerby to slow down, to take it in, to give it meaning for themselves. A candle in a window is not unusual, but here, in this moment, it feels bound to something older. It's a gesture as old as the pairing of flame and glass, used to welcome, to remember, to mark safety, or to mourn. In the year we've just traced, it gathers all those meanings at once. No explanation sits beside it. Like the flags lowered after November, like the slow tolling of church bells, the act alone carries the message. It is a private mirror of the public rituals, the same language of remembrance spoken in a quieter key. The light changes with nightfall. Street lamps spread their pale arcs across the slick road, shadow pressing down between them. In the houses nearby, curtains are drawn, but here the window stays uncovered, so the candle's glow can be seen from outside. Years from now, someone might walk by and notice it without knowing the exact events that placed it there, and still feel its weight. That's the bridge symbols make, between those who lived through a moment and those who come later. Through the rain, the flame grows sharper. The water outside blurs edges and softens lines until all else recedes. The candle holds steady in contrast, refusing to be lost in the wash of gray. It doesn't ask for action. It asks for presence, a moment to see, to mark, to join silently in what it stands for. A candle doesn't replay what happened. It doesn't restore the details. Instead, it holds space for the events that gave it meaning, keeping them alive in a form the present can accept. Some who see it will have their own memory of those days. Others will have only what was told to them. But either way, the flame offers an open place for that memory to rest a while. If someone were to ask why the candle burns there, to remember might be all they'd answer. But the light also marks where the personal meets the shared. Across the country, many flames, some visible, others tucked in corners, add up to the same story. Even events lived in full public view eventually find their way into the small, unseen gestures inside homes. The rain eases, tapping lightly against the glass like a measured knock. Vehicles pass now and then, their headlights slipping over the wall for an instant before disappearing. These changes keep the scene alive, but the pacing stays apart from whatever rush might exist elsewhere. It's the kind of stillness that lets you look closely without distraction. Standing at a distance, the candle's glow frames you too, reminding you of where you are in relation to it. Outside looking in, carrying whatever personal connection you have to its meaning. That reflection is part of its work. It doesn't only speak for the past, it turns the past back toward you, so your own recollections give it shape. Flames move at their own pace. This one will last until its watcher decides to end the vigil, or until it burns itself down. By then, the street will lie under full dark, the rain settled into the softer rhythm of late night. Long after, the image will remain in the mind, one clear flame holding a place for far more than its size could suggest. When you step away, the sight comes with you, folding into the ongoing thread of remembrance. It runs alongside the archival records, the televised moments, the silent lines of mourners. A candle in a window is entirely personal, yet part of a shared language. It asks nothing more than that its light be noticed, and in being noticed, be carried forward. The rain keeps its quiet pattern, glass fogged slightly from the warmth inside. The flame lifts and steadies with each draft. Outside, the pavement takes the lamp's reflections and breaks them into ripples. It isn't a conclusion so much as a pause in motion, a still point in the turning of seasons and years. For anyone who sees it, the candle becomes an opening, a place to step closer to memory and hold it, if only for a moment. And when you leave it behind, it stays with you, not just as an image, but as an idea. That small light, steady against the dark, can travel alongside you, its meaning shifting to fit the paths you walk. It's a light you can take with you into what comes next. For many, 1963 felt like the year America's sense of innocence shifted. Familiar routines faltered, and the silence that followed still moves through memory, shaping how we recall leadership, loss, and one another. If you lived through it, or heard the story from someone close, share one detail in the comments: where you were, or who first told you. History survives not only in books or photographs, but in small acts of remembrance. a candle in the window, a photograph kept nearby, a single line you've never forgotten. If these quiet histories matter to you, consider subscribing to this channel.